Yeah, I mean, we're as an American public, what we're being sold is hope,
Yes.
right? We're not being sold drugs that are proven to be effective. I mean, I'm talking about newer drugs, newly approved drugs. We're being sold hope. The pharmaceutical industry is preying on Americans' hope.
Somebody get this guy some help!
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
I am hyped tonight. We got Michael Shuman back.
Really good to be back. I'm excited about this topic.
Michael's been back several times, and I think that we'll never run out of drugs to talk about.
New drugs come out, and there's new things to gripe about with them.
Yep. And somehow they just keep getting approved, even when they don't work and they're not safe. Huh?
Yep.
But that's why we're here to talk to you about these things, and really kind of an extension of direct-to-consumer advertising and the harms that it causes, because you're giving information to the general public that really needs to be read with a fine-tooth comb by people who have a lot of years of education tailored directly towards understanding medicine and pharmacology. We're going to talk about what are called monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, tends to affect people after the age of 65, but overall, it kind of progresses. One of the first kind of clinical signs, symptoms that you tend to see revolves around short-term memory loss and dysfunction in what's called the hippocampus, or the memory center of the brain. But it's very important to point out, and most people probably know this because a lot of us have seen or dealt with Alzheimer's in family members, or certainly if you're in the medical community, you've seen it. It's a long and progressive disease. It's not something that typically kills somebody in a couple of years. It usually takes close to 10 years from the time the person is diagnosed, and really probably from the time the process starts, probably closer to 20 years. So this is not something that is life-threatening in an acute time frame. And that's really important to consider for a couple of factors. One is, if you have a drug that's not safe, I don't want my grandma to have a drug that'll cut, the 10 remaining years of her life off at the potential benefit of adding maybe a few months or a year. And that's if she's the lucky one that gets that benefit, versus one of the people who dies the second time they get an infusion of one of these drugs from a brain bleed or brain swelling. The other important consideration here is that these drugs, aducanumab, lecanemab, donanemab, they all got accelerated approval. You're talking about accelerating the approval of a drug that we're not going to know whether it's effective or not for another 10 years. Because with a disease like Alzheimer's, you've got to have 10 or even 15 years worth of data on a drug to prove the most important outcome, which is how long somebody lives and how functional they are in the long term. You need that time frame to be able to prove that a drug for Alzheimer's works.
This idea about functional outcomes is even a new thing. For years and years, that was not something that was regarded in medications. Sadly, is fairly new about using disability rating scales or looking at functional outcomes. The other thing I think that is important to notice about that is this is also a very emotional subject. And that's the one thing I think that sometimes we have to be careful of with some of these approvals. If this gives my loved one a chance, it's worth it. And so I think sometimes that emotional argument then maybe also gets people to buy into medications that even if there isn't the data, it's the idea is if this could work, I want it. Almost that you're treating the family, not the person, is the idea that if we don't use this medicine, we're acknowledging we have nothing to do. And we're acknowledging we can't fix this. And nobody wants to acknowledge that. So there's, well, let's at least try the medication. So I think those things then lead to maybe an acceptance of some of those risks you mentioned that kind of flies in the face of objective data.
Yeah, I mean, we're as an American public, what we're being sold is hope,
Yes.
right? We're not being sold drugs that are proven to be effective. I mean, I'm talking about newer drugs, newly approved drugs. We're being sold hope. The pharmaceutical industry is preying on Americans' hope.
Despite the emotional content, there is have a critical appraisal of, okay, are there unintended consequences of giving into this hope, if you will?
Yeah. And hopefully over the course of all the different examples that we bring up,
Yep.
our listeners or our viewers come to the conclusion that this is just continues to happen repeatedly.
Yep.
We've got to stop falling victim to these essentially mind games.
I mean, they should probably like it. There should be some sort of enjoyment factor with this.
Right. And so you could imagine that instead of taking the reports of 1,000 people and calculating the data and saying, this was the best cake, instead I just said, well, how many chocolate chips does each cake have on it? And the one with the most chocolate chips is going to be the best as determined by me.
Right, because we know that people like chocolate chips, so that is our surrogate endpoint for deliciousness.
Exactly. So a drug removing beta-amyloid, it's promising, but that theory is maybe not as sound as we thought. So aducanumab was approved by the FDA, given this conditional or accelerated approval in 2021.
They just don't really do a confirmatory trial.
This drug was approved despite the FDA's own scientific advisory board voting 10-0 against it. There was one person who said that they were uncertain. There were 3 people of those 11 who resigned from the FDA board. It's also notable because of the manipulation of the way the data has been presented to Americans, giving us this report of what's called relative risk, or the difference that the drug shows compared to a placebo, as opposed to the absolute risk, which is typically what patients and what providers want to know. How much will this decrease my progression of symptoms over the time of the study? It's also extremely dangerous. These medicines are, first iteration of it, the aducanumab, was causing up to 40% of its participants to have brain swelling. And some of those develop brain bleeds, which can be fatal and have been fatal in the clinical trials. We'll talk a little bit about how this accelerated approval is being misused, something that maybe makes more sense for a condition like ALS, which is extremely severe, progressive in a rapid time frame, and universally fatal. And then we'll talk a little bit about, primary outcome measures, secondary outcome measures. Does removing beta amyloid or tau protein actually improve cognitive symptoms? We'll touch on a bunch of different drugs. We'll talk about aducanumab and lecanemab and donanemab, but we'll also dive into some of the original research that laid the groundwork for these drugs even coming to market. We'll take a little brief pit stop on a drug called simufilam, another drug called prasinezumab for Parkinson's disease, and also briefly touch on a drug for, I don't know if this is just Louisville psychiatry or if it's national
it's been other
psychiatry.
places. That's one of my favorite things. Is all right, can we lower the dose? It's been 5 days. Let's lower the dose. Let's make it PRN. Let's just get rid of it. Or we can use another antipsychotic.
Oh my God. I mean, I cannot believe how many patients I saw in residency who were on 1 milligram of Cogentin twice a day in perpetuity.
Yeah, the fact that you need that should be a clue you need to make a change.
Yeah, just for the background on that, Cogentin or benztropine is a medicine that's extremely anticholinergic. And medicines that are anticholinergic or substances that are anticholinergic, they slow our brains down. In patients with dementia, they already have a balance between acetylcholine and dopamine that is thrown off. And when you add an acetylcholine blocker to that, you're going to get bad results. Their cognitive impairment is going to worsen in the temporary time frame, if not the permanent time frame, if they're on them long enough.
Yeah, things like delirium get thrown about. Sometimes it gets interchanged with dementia, even though they're totally different. But yeah, the idea is that we can do some addition by subtraction first before we go down the road of I need to use a pro-cognitive medication. Let's at least get rid of the anti-cognitive ones.
Right.
Several months ago, a long-term patient of mine with prominent memory loss, but otherwise healthy, was attempted to be enrolled in one of the ongoing clinical trials for lecanemab, a medication approved for Alzheimer's dementia in the United States in 2023 due to its ability to remove beta-amyloid from the tissue of the brain, with a faulty jump to the conclusion that this would translate into a clinical benefit of slowing the progression of Alzheimer's or even reversing its course. Unfortunately, not everything in science that theoretically should work actually works in clinical practice. But the drug industry and its regulators are increasingly preying on the hope and sometimes gullibility of the American public that technological advances will continually arrive with all benefit and no risk. That is certainly not the case with the three non-traditional FDA pathway for Alzheimer's disease since 2021: aducanumab or Aduhelm, lecanemab or Leqembi, and donanemab or Kisunla. Marketers even try to prey on people like me, who tout the need for us to find root causes of disease instead of just masking symptoms, by labeling these drugs as disease modifying. Yes, they may modify the disease in a way that increases its progression to death in some. Beyond this alarming outcome, these beta-amyloid removing drugs also do not outperform existing medications for dementia, therefore not offering much of anything outside of excess side effects and making Americans' wallets and bank accounts significantly lighter. I had already been on a crusade against the original 2021 accelerated approval of aducanumab, as it was one of the sketchiest approvals in the FDA's history. It was approved despite the FDA Scientific Advisory Panel voting 10-0 against its approval, with 3 people resigning after the vote. It was approved despite an almost 2 out of 5 or 40% risk of brain swelling. And it was another clear indication that the FDA of today is essentially a subsidiary of Big Pharma. But when you start fucking with my patients, putting them at risk for severe side effects and death, when they not only have 10 plus years of life left to live, but also years of functional life left, that really grinds my gears. Honestly, it pisses me off. You don't have to be some devout theologian to see that it's just not right. And if non-medical persons have access to this information presented in a way that they can understand, they'll also realize it's not right. Little did I know that the corruption goes much deeper than the bullshit accelerated approvals of lecanemab and aducanumab for a condition that is mostly preventable and people can live with for more than 10 years. There is also rampant evidence of manipulated research going back decades, with some of the most prominent names in neurodegenerative research's work being called out for manipulating and faking some of the research that paved the way for the eventual development of these dangerous drugs. What are we doing to ourselves in this country?
Just like an Alzheimer's patient, if they live long enough, they will develop signs of Parkinson's as well. So in 2022, Journal Science released this investigative report on a long-standing neurodegenerative disease researcher, very, very well respected in the field. His name is Sylvain Lesny. They found that since 2006, he had been photoshopping and copy and pasting multiple images to make the beta amyloid theory, which he's a big proponent of, seem like it is more likely as the cause for Alzheimer's. He did this in one very specific example where they pointed out that he used photoshopped images to show that it caused dementia in rats. And it has been going on essentially throughout his entire career. Historically, other researchers had extreme difficulty replicating any of his findings. There's a neuroscientist and physician at Vanderbilt named Matthew Schrag, who was tasked to actually review a different set of data and researcher, but he stumbled across Lesnie's work, and he says that all of these had to be prepared by Lesnie, that the consistency is Lesnie was involved with all of them. There were several other co-authors, but it doesn't look like they were aware of what he was doing.
Again, I mentioned there's such an emotional subject, and knowingly building up a foundation that is questionable at best. Like the motivation behind that and just the implications of it. I just need to make a moment to say, like, again, that's wow.
If you're like me, if you're somebody who is really passionate about the truth and advancing our understanding, like, it fucking pisses me off. I mean, I'm just reading through this material, and it is such an egregious and repetitive thing that has been happening in this field of science for such a long time. You're talking about probably billions of dollars of misdirected funding because of being able to convince all these people in this field that your data is legitimate. Well, I guess not all of them, but enough people and the companies that fund this type of research. It's really thrown us off course for decades now in getting closer to the legitimate causes of Alzheimer's. It really makes me wonder, in reviewing all this, is there direct collusion involved? Or are these people just acting with their best personal interests in mind? A couple of aspects of that is, we've got a system now where we've got all of these journals, right? I couldn't tell you how many there are, but there's hundreds and hundreds of different scientific academic journals. But they're absolutely failing to do one of their primary jobs, which is to regulate, to fact check, to peer review prior to publishing. When the investigators for this science article, before it came out, they reached out to all of these journals who had published Lesnie's papers to try to get a comment. Journals including Nature, Science Signaling, the Journal of Neuroscience, and 4 others all declined to make a specific comment. There's also the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the governmental body that we were saying really their job should be to independently verify that they can get the same results as these companies are getting for their drug that they stand to profit and monetize significantly from. The NIH declined comment on this 2022 article, other than saying it takes research misconduct seriously. It doesn't appear that a lot of the co-researchers with Lesnie were in on it. Karen Ash, who was with him at University of Minnesota, said that she felt misled and that she thought that that theory was going down the wrong road for a long time. She worked directly with Lesnie for a while, and she does indicate that she still believes that there's good beta-amyloid data and research out there, that it still is a possible therapeutic target, and not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, along with others stating the similar things. But so many of his former co-authors came out on the Alz Forum, which is an Alzheimer's kind of forum for people to comment, and it's one place where this article was put in a brief form. A lot of these researchers, Jürgen Goetz in Queensland, Charles Glabe at UC Irvine, they responded to the allegations and, acknowledged that, yeah, this does appear to be manipulated. But it makes me wonder, is there collusion between the companies, the journals, and the NIH? It sounds a little conspiratorial, but at the same time, we're seeing the same patterns play out over and over and over again.
And as I've said, you'll see where there is an entire paradigm shift where everybody abandons a certain mechanism. As I said, metabotrophic glutamate 2/3 receptors. Eli Lilly had a study that went bad. As far as I know, that was the first one, and then the entire thing just got dropped. Or with phosphodiesterase, where it does seem like, whether it's collusion or just that everybody knows what everyone else is doing, where something happens and it's like no one's going down that path anymore. And then as well as the idea too that, things like how we do our peer reviews, anonymous peer reviews, and not falling prey to the idea that appealing to authority, like, well, this person's above reproach. So who am I to do a peer review of this person who's so far above me? And I like journals that have that anonymous peer review, or even British Medical Journal, which their comments almost sometimes was a Facebook page, because they will let anybody comment on there, and you can write in there like who you are, your credentials. There was an article, I think I talked about it the other day, is Jane Clinton Psych just had an article out called Psychopharmacologic Laziness.
Yeah.
And I loved it because he flat out said it, and he called out his fellow physicians, and he said lithium, clozapine, LAIs. Not using these is because you're lazy. Like, these will work. He's like, I will die on the hill of clozapine and lithium, and you're not using them because you're lazy.
We've talked about this with lithium a lot, but clozapine too. Is some of the REMS program or some of the hoops that you have to jump or that you historically had to jump through that they're now lifting, thank God.
Yeah, I almost cried. Watching
it's
that.
Pretty amazing because you're going to see people doing so much better, in the next couple of months. When you get more people on clozapine that are really sick, they're going to get better. But it makes you wonder, is that by design? Because clozapine is extremely cheap. And you've got dozens upon dozens of new antipsychotics or newer profitable antipsychotics. Is all of that, again, it gets to where it sounds conspiratorial. There's also a lot of very reputable and smart individuals who are noticing similar trends.
Yeah. If you've ever seen the meme, there's a guy posing by a grave marker like this, like a list of all the drugs that have gotten withdrawn from the market since lithium came out. There have been entire mechanisms that have died off, or this has come out and that, but lithium is still around because it freaking works. There is nothing like it. Yeah, we're talking an entire foundation now we're finding is just that sand is starting to just shift under it.
And same things, copy and pasting images within and across different papers, sometimes years apart in separate journals. And these papers, here's our next drug, they paved the way for a drug called prasinezumab, which is made by a company, Prothena, that has some sort of financial connection with Hoffman LaRoche. But this prasinezumab is a anti-Parkinson's drug. And in 2022, the FDA denied its approval based on a 316 patient study revealed in the New England Journal of Medicine, where the clinical trial showed no benefit compared to placebo, was not FDA approved. But importantly, this drug has been approved in several other countries.
So again, we'll give the FDA credit on that one, at least.
Got to give them credit where it's due. A couple of notable kind of comments on this one. One notable comment, sorry, but it's kind of funny.
I'm bracing myself.
So Samuel Gandy is a prominent neurologist at Mount Sinai Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. He says hundreds of images reveal ongoing manipulation for years, and the bus driver could see that they're identical in terms of the images that were just copy and pasted in several different articles. And he specifically references mitochondria in two different papers that were 2 years apart in two separate journals.
And again, I'm hearing this for the first time. And my first thought, too, is when you're talking about images, which we can, at least with images, you can show that they're manipulated or static across different places. If somebody were to doctor numbers, it's much harder to prove that unless you have the raw data. So this is just something we can observe. Doctoring or malfeasance in other areas is almost unprovable.
Yeah, it's almost like comparing two snowflakes. There's no two Western blots that are the same.
They were called out on this, but who knows what other stuff not involving images may be manipulated or used for an end that we don't know of.
Exactly, because this is the stuff that we can prove.
Right. And that's the biggest concern.
And there are so many other concerns with some of these clinical trials that I have. Like, if I was the investigator that had the financials on the line, well, if I'm trying to compare an Alzheimer's drug to a placebo, I want my placebo to be not noticeably necessarily in the numbers sicker, but I want them to be further along in their progression, because I want to see the placebo drop off more than my drug, regardless of what the effect of my drug is. Why we shouldn't have raw data and methodology available to anybody who wants to review it, please reach out and let me know, because I just don't see, if we're really trying to advance scientific understanding and make progress, I don't see how anybody with that goal in mind would say, no, let's restrict the data.
Yeah, because again, if I've got that recipe of chocolate chip cookies and I want to prove that my recipe is the best, then somebody else should be able to say, yeah, I followed the directions and I got to the same results.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to September of 24, when this science article came out, for years, people were calling out Maslia and the NIH, and it was the same story. Deny, deny, deny until we just absolutely can't anymore. 2 weeks after this article, this investigation was brought to light, the NIH released a statement, and they said, NIH has made findings of research misconduct, and Maslia no longer serves as the neuroscience division director. They didn't comment on whether he was still employed in any capacity, and Maslia didn't comment, nor did he respond to requests for raw images or the original data. He also did not deny wrongdoing. It's just like, we're going to pin you against the wall. You're absolutely caught. And then you're going to come out with a statement. The thing that pisses me off the most, the NIH had made findings of research misconduct. No, you didn't.
Yeah, so it makes it sound that it was their decision. We found out this thing. It was new to us. We investigated it. We found it out on our own without any kind of prompting, if you will.
Right. Or somebody comes to him and says, this is what I've found. And thus they say, well, we will investigate internally. And all they're really doing, I mean, it's like any, story that you want to spin a certain way. You're going to state that, yeah, we're going to investigate this matter. We're looking into it. And while you're doing that, you're going to, behind closed doors, get all the information you can about what they know so that you can propagate your lie even further. So one of the things that, you said the FDA did, we had to give them credit because they declined to approve the drug. Despite knowing all of this, they still greenlit human clinical trials, despite having evidence that there were some suspect papers.
Oof.
There's a couple examples here. We could say the example of the cake, right? The merit of the most delicious cake should be held with the 100 people who try your cake and my cake, and they get to decide. But then when they decide that Michael's cake is better than my cake,
because it is,
well, that's debatable, okay? But at that point, then I say, well, let's go to a secondary outcome measure of how many chocolate chips does it have on it. And mine has more chocolate chips. Therefore, mine is effective, aka mine's tastier. But don't worry about the primary outcome data. That doesn't matter.
Yeah, maybe we're only looking at the ones that liked your cake out of that sample.
The other example I thought of was, you're on the playground and you're playing basketball, playing against the bully in the class, right? And they're bigger than you, but you play a great game.
We're getting some flashbacks here.
You're playing a great game and you beat the bully, right? You beat him 10-9. And then what does the bully do? He says, no, we were actually playing for who could get the least number of points. That's who wins.
Golf rules. Yes.
It's like, what are you talking about? But I mean, it's the same idea here. The discussionary point here, and I'm asking you this question, I know the answer. Should performance measures dictate financial transactions between pharmaceutical companies?
And again, if everything is simply based upon the incentivizing the financials, that will push us towards getting the research done as quickly and as, people can get fired if I don't show this drug works. And so whether you want to or not, you're incentivized to get the product out there.
There's so much money changing hands. There's so much financial pressure. Sometimes I kind of feel a little bit bad for some of these executives who maybe do have a moral bone in their body, and they just feel, I'm sure they deal with an excruciating amount of pressure to meet these performance measures.
Yeah, and there's organizations too big to fail where it's like, there's something wrong, but it's like, if I call it out, I'm bringing down a lot of good people. And again, that's a tough spot to be at, but that's where we need to be able to check ourselves and make sure that as a society, we're not propping up people with ill intentions.
The more years that I do this, one thing that I recognize about myself is I hate, more than most things, just being told what somebody thinks that I want to hear, because that is so often disgenuine. And that's what we're talking about. It's, in these small circles, I don't think everybody is like, hey, we're manipulating this, we're doing this. No, I think it's just something that you don't talk about and you don't bring up, and you just tell each other what you want to hear that is consistent with the deal getting done.
Yeah, and that's why, like, even in research, there's things like funnel plots where the whole goal is to show that if all your data is perfect, that's the best indicator that it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Like, it should be expected to be a reasonable amount of pro and con, or positive and negative. And if there's not, then it means that something's gone on, that we're cherry picking certain things.
Yeah.
And that's why you need to have that, like you said, that there has to be the balance there to make sure we're doing it right.
Which I would argue are the vast majority of scientists are overshadowed by assholes seeking to be recognized and empowered based on false findings. And I'd love to be able to say it is only isolated to this one area of neurodegenerative disease research. Based on the flagrant, blatant, and pervasive examples throughout recent and remote medical history, I would guess the problem is just as widespread in other research avenues as it is in the fields of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and neurodegenerative diseases. These are conditions that, even if you're able to capture only a couple percentage points of the population with these diseases, that's a lot of people, and companies stand to profit generously from the sale of these drugs. I think oftentimes people like Sylvan Lesnie and Elazir Maslia are able to peddle their nonsense and bullshit pseudoscience because so many other entities stand to profit as well and back them up. Then, when they're caught, those other entities find a way to stay out of the general public spotlight. They tend to deny wrongdoing and avoid direct confrontation or debate, instead relying on press releases and nonspecific statements alleging it's all just a big misunderstanding and they're just being mistreated. One trend I've noticed in my own training program and up to the highest ranks of Kentucky and national medical establishments is that those in power typically fall into two categories: yes men and women, and narcissists. The former make it known that they're willing to be controlled for the perks that come with the job. But the latter are the bigger problem. They don't care about the pursuit of truth, but they do know how to manipulate others to believe that they do. They are only concerned with climbing the ranks of some imaginary corporate power ladder, constantly striving to achieve enough control and influence that it will appease their sad inner sense of insignificance and irrelevance. But little do they know, they will always feel unfulfilled, especially seeking fulfillment from the outside world or from positive appraisals from those people who are in power, as they will always ultimately feel lesser than. And when they're discovered for just what they are, con men and crooks, they'll not only disappear from scientific significance with a huge and smelly stain on their reputation forever, they will live on in infamy.
I know there's some people who say that, the statins aren't even worth the side effect risk of them. But I think there is probably better data on the statins than there is on something like the monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's.
And again, we found ways to mitigate some of the myalgia risk with statins, whether it's using a low dose or using rosuvastatin or giving it every other day. Some have used CoQ10 or some have used vitamin D to mitigate it. And so we have these certain factors that even shift the risk versus benefit a little bit more so.
So, yeah, I just wanted to get a little bit of historical information about how this is not the first time that we've used a biomarker. It's a kind of out of the playbook of Big Pharma.
And actually, to that point, the FDA, you can even go on their website and they have a listing of approved biomarkers or approved endpoints. And there's a whole bunch of them that are used. And some of them are very basic, like, presence of, an antigen.
So let's jump forward to aducanumab's 2021 when the approval came out. This is a drug that is $56,000 a year, not covered by insurance. They recruited early Alzheimer's disease patients, aka healthy patients without comorbidities, with what's called or deemed mild neurocognitive impairment. Big question there is, what percent of actual total Alzheimer's disease patients in my patient population, like we've talked about so often, have no comorbidities? That probably is not a great population to study when you want to look at the safety, especially of a particular drug class.
And with that too
ahead.
is the idea about, again, to enter the study having the way it is diagnosed. And that's been the tricky thing about Alzheimer's. I have seen the term just thrown out there, again, whether it's cognitive impairment or just this person is on a lot of anticholinergic medications, using the term Alzheimer's dementia without really having a lot of concrete reason for it. So the problem too becomes they had a very formalized process for inclusion into the study. That again is, are we going to the same granular level of identifying our patients in practice? And do we have access to the same level of testing and imaging and practice that we had in enrolling people in the study? Probably not. So that's the trick is, are we then using it in a much wider population than in which it was originally tested?
And do you trust the randomization process of the company that stands to benefit financially from their study looking good? Did they recruit slightly healthier patients to the aducanumab group? Alzheimer's is a clinical diagnosis. You don't see dysfunction on an MRI, definitely not initially. Again, I'm not saying this has happened. I'm just, positing that it is possible that you could recruit really healthy people to ensure that you're getting the most likely population to show that your drug is safe. And then maybe you recruit patients who are a little bit more, clearly have the developing early kind of signs of Alzheimer's in the placebo group. If you can find the patients that are right on the cusp of starting to decline a little bit more rapidly, that's perfect for your placebo group, because you're definitively going to show a difference between drug and placebo at that point. This is a drug that has a 33 to 40+% risk, aducanumab, of what's called ARIA. And as you pointed out, ARIA sounds so nice, right?
It's a songs and
it's a Game of Thrones character that everybody loves and wants to see do well. And so ARIA stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. It sounds a lot nicer than what it is.
What if I said microhemorrhage?
Exactly. So Boston University neurologist and neuroscientist Andreas Chiridomau said, we need a name change because these are not just imaging abnormalities. These are things that cause brain swelling and brain bleeding. And you and I have talked about this. If you imagine beta-amyloid, which aggregates into plaques, so clusters of beta-amyloid, and these things can deposit in a lot of different areas. One place that they can deposit is in our blood vessels. And if you've got a drug that removes that from the wall of a blood vessel, or if you want to think of it as a hose, from the wall of a hose, it's probably when you pull that out, just like if you tried to pull a bug out of a spider web, it's going to be really hard to pull the bug out without messing with the integrity of the web itself. That same thing happens with beta amyloid plaques that are lining blood vessel walls. So when they're pulled out, it creates a blood vessel wall that is either inflamed and contributing to inflammation. Though I would add that you probably also could just, for most people who don't have genetic forms of high cholesterol, they could probably just eat better and exercise better, and they would get to the same outcomes without the risks of the side effects.
Yeah, I'm actually going to read a quote here. So this is one of those from some of the FDA reviewers. They said, there is no compelling correlation between effects on amyloid beta plaques and effects on CDR-SB. And CDR-SB is the clinical dementia rating sum of boxes, which is one of those big outcomes. So there's no correlation between the plaques and effects on that at the patient level. But then at the same time, when they approved
It's
this
based
drug,
on the
they
CDR-SB
said
and
the
a
re-
27%
Yep.
improvement.
They said the relationship between amyloid beta plaque reduction and CDR-SB for aducanumab was consistent with the relationship observed for other compounds targeting amyloid beta. However, none of those other, I guess me speaking, none of those other molecules made it through to approval because of safety outcomes or due to efficacy.
There is insanity.
We're saying this drug works because it proves the amyloid hypothesis, but it's also the first drug to prove the hypothesis.
So here's another very straightforward. You don't have to be a scientist to understand this one. The FDA Scientific Advisory Panel, an 11-person panel composed of really, really well-respected scientists, clinicians, researchers. They voted 10-0 against this drug being approved by the FDA. The FDA totally ignored their recommendation and approved it anyway. There was one person who voted, they didn't vote yes for approval, they voted uncertain. And after all this played out, people on that panel were fucking pissed. They were like, why am I doing this if my opinion in all 10 of our opinions, 10-0, 100% of people voted against, well, 10 out of 11. The other person didn't vote for, but Aaron Kesselheim was one of 3 individuals on that panel who resigned after this. Aaron Kesselheim is an attorney and a physician teaching at Harvard. I don't know if you've ever heard of Harvard.
It's a small school.
It's a small school, but apparently they do pretty good things over there. He said in his open resignation letter criticizing the FDA and their decision that it was probably the worst drug approval decision in recent U.S. history.
I believe it.
He added that accelerated approval is not supposed to be the backup that you use when your clinical trial data is not good enough. I don't know how you say it any better, but there's a couple other people who tried to. One of them is Robert Wang, private practice, MD, PhD, internist with 40 years of experience. He's worked as
your average citizen, right?
Exactly. Your average primary care physician that specializes in the geriatric population, has 40 years of experience as an MD, a PhD, is based in Los Angeles. He wrote a great response to some FDA perspective article on trying to convince people like you and me why it's a good thing that it got approved, even though it was 10-0 voted against it being approved by the scientists. So Robert Wang says, studies show no meaningful signal for clinical benefit with aducanumab. The signal is for amyloid removal, but this has not demonstrated significant clinical benefit with a sizable group of recipients developing mild to severe amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, leading to accelerated functional decline. So the justification really should read, bypassing this opportunity might miss minimal improvement for a small proportion of patients at the cost of significant complications for a different group, although data are lacking to even prove that minimal improvement exists.
That goes back to, I think, some of that emotional argument, which is we don't want to miss out on this. It could be helpful for people, and we'd be really afraid to miss out on this, which again goes back to being careful to bypass data and logic because of this emotional, which again, this is a really sucky condition, and we don't want it to happen. So if there's a chance that this drug could work, we want it to have it, but at the same time, should we bypass the rigors of the model we've already established?
And I'm all for individuals being allowed to make the decision that they think is best for them, even if I think they're making a bad decision. So if you have an individual with Alzheimer's who decides in them or their family, they decide that they want to be in this trial with all of the data up front and in front of them, and that says, you know, this isn't likely to improve you very much, but if you want to try, the reality is that we have to have people in our society that are willing to try new drugs to get the data. But I'm not going to subject any of my patients to that through any sort of manipulation or any sort of leaving out details about what might happen to them. If they decide they want to cross that bridge with understanding of the risks, aka actual informed consent, then I am all for it. But otherwise, we are subjecting people to a very dangerous drug or drug class, offering them the promise that they're going to be rehabilitated, that their condition is going to change.
And with that, I think it's a concern too that, again, making sure that, many times the drug is approved and it goes into a market and utilization far outside of what it was used in. I believe they were doing PET scans to identify the amyloid plaques for these individuals. Yep. How often are you referring your patients for PET scans?
Lecanemab, the protocol for that, and the reason I know this is because they tried to recruit one of my patients. They tried to recruit her for lecanemab for the infusions, and she was going to have to go through all of these different MRIs. It's an average of 5 every year, which the cost of an MRI these days is about $2,500, if not more. So that alone, you're talking about $15,000 for the MRIs alone. But it's a very specific process. They've got to get all the genetic markers of ApoE.
I think where we're going with it is the idea that releasing it to a market where we're going to expect you, if you're being on this drug, to spend thousands and thousands of dollars in these extra costs that you may not be aware of. Or maybe the worst thing of it is we're going to be releasing it and utilizing it in individuals where we have no idea of their ApoE4 status. We may not even know if there are signs of amyloid plaques because we're not doing the PET scans. And we're maybe not doing the ARIA monitoring.
I think they mandate that stuff for somebody to get the drug. They have to go through and make sure they're not double ApoE4, which is a positive thing. Like I will grant that.
But again, you're putting a lot of onus on, it has to be done this way. But again, is it going to? Or are you going to, like anything, are you going to release it? And then there's going to be a lot of kind of on-label, kind of off-label utilization. That's the one issue with it. Is this drug going to find it into the market, the population for which it's beneficial, or is it going to be used for a lot more? And therefore, again, from a societal cost perspective, both safety and efficacy, are we going to lose out on?
Nancy Olivieri, she wrote an opinion article on this titled, "Nothing is right about the approval of aducanumab, ... and nothing's new." So Nancy Olivieri, the reason why she is in such a good place in terms of her experience to respond to this is her background is in a drug called deferiprone. And so Nancy Olivieri is was a heme-onc specialist, a thalassemia researcher. Thalassemia is a condition where a protein doesn't function properly, or the genetic variation of the copies that somebody get are not functioning properly in terms of creating blood cells. And so these people can have abnormally functioning blood cells that they don't work like they're supposed to carry oxygen from the lungs and out to all of the other tissues of the body. And in major forms of it, they can lead to fatality within a couple of years. So she developed this drug, deferiprone, in 1989, and she partnered with this company, Apotex, with pharmaceutical company, with the CEO, Barry Sherman, to help fund and run clinical trials in kids because it's a relatively rare disease. In 1991, just 2 years later, she recognized some major safety issues, and she said, we got to pull the plug. But the CEO of Apotex, Barry Sherman, he threatened her. He said, we're going to sue you. If you go public, we're going to, degrade your reputation, and threatened all this litigation.
Which is all part of the scientific process, right?
Exactly, right? Nancy Olivieri said, I don't give a fuck what you do. I'm going public anyway.
Did she actually say that?
No, she didn't.
Okay,
I said that. I
said
she degaffed. She degaffed. She says, we're pulling the plug, went public, and Sherman targeted her. Sherman said that she was falsifying trial data to make it seem like it didn't work. Like, what? That's another one of those like emojis. She has all the vested interests, both monetarily and in terms of her prestige and reputation, for this thing to work.
And she's probably brought the facts. I mean, you can... Yeah.
Absolutely. But what she realizes is, I've been down this road. I've been putting years and years of my life into this, but it's going to harm my patients. So I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to subject them to that. Sherman also said that she was committing a purported thousands of protocol violations. This was a decades-long battle with multiple lawsuits by Sherman against Olivieri. In 2009, this is 20 years after they first made contact with each other.
Wow.
Sherman applies for FDA approval, and the FDA commissions the Department of Scientific Investigation to inspect Olivieri's original clinical trial. And after a week of scrutiny around the clinical trial, they confirm her safety concerns. And they also find that Barry Sherman has submitted data that intentionally excludes 45% of the test subjects that were in the original clinical trial.
Wait, who was falsifying the data?
Exactly, right? It gets better in terms of the hypocrisy of the FDA.
Uh-oh.
What Sherman does is he pools all of this selected data from...
Don't get me started on the pool data. That's right.
I know.
It's a trick.
From older studies using surrogate markers. And what does the FDA do?
Uh-oh.
They granted accelerated approval anyway. That's where Olivieri's title to this up-to-date article or current article, Nothing is Right About the Approval of Aducanumab and Nothing's New, because her drug had gotten accelerated approval back in 2011. Olivieri warns patients and providers. She asks in this recent article, what function does the FDA now serve in comparing defeperone to aducanumab? And she says, now more than ever, we need regulatory agencies that don't simply conjure up profit-generating hype, but approve products as safe and effective because they are safe and effective. She also points out very appropriately that 65% of the FDA's budget, almost 2/3, used for the drug approval process is financed by industry, by big pharmaceutical companies.
Again, the conflict of interest there is massive. Even if you're trying to be as ethical as you can, if you know that your department is going to ride or die based upon some level of appeasement of a company, it's going to be hard to be objective.
Yeah. And she pointed out something that was very, very telling to me, because it explained to me why aducanumab was pulled from the market earlier this year. She says accelerated approval means that Biogen and Eisai have to do a post-approval trial, stage 4, which takes years. That leads to them reaping in profits before it has to actually show in the long term clear benefit on cognitive decline measures.
I think the core of it is noble, is the idea that we're willing to get this drug on the market because we think it's so important. The idea is these are unmet needs. These are conditions in which they're life-threatening or there's a huge gap in the market. Therefore, we're going to let people get in on it because it has so much benefit. But then you said that the negative of it, though, is it then allows a drug to get on the market and reap benefit even before it's finished the process.
And this is where it really starts to grind my gears, to quote Peter Griffin.
Yes.
So in 2024, as aducanumab is not gaining a lot of traction, but there's people who are buying into the hype and spending $50,000 a year and probably dying an early death, Aduhelm is pulled from the market and it terminates its stage 4 trial. And the data from the stage 4 trial is lost. Now, Michael, you're a smart guy.
Hopefully. Let's find out.
You're a good critical thinker. Can you imagine why Biogen and Eisai would abandon their potential multi-million, billion-dollar drug aducanumab at the beginning of 2024 when they've done all this work and they've got 2.5 years into their stage 4 clinical trial? Why would they just abandon that? Can you imagine?
Again, I'm going to guess because we might have either, if we've unblinded or we've revealed kind of an interim analysis, and maybe it's not as favorable as we would like.
Maybe they saw something that wasn't favorable, and maybe they had another drug that was similar, that was newer, and they could reset the cycle. in lecanemab.
Ah. Oh, yes. Yeah, I noticed the same company. Interesting.
The same exact two companies that make the first one that are 2.5 years into their stage 4 clinical trial that they don't have to release about the long-term safety and efficacy. All of a sudden, there's the newest iteration that works better. Now, half of Alzheimer's disease patients have a condition called cerebral amyloid angiopathy. This is where you can see the deposits on imaging on the insides of blood vessels and what we were talking about earlier. And so when those plaques deposit and they replace smooth muscle cells of a blood vessel, which are integral to that blood vessel wall functioning appropriately in an artery to squeeze to get blood through and then to release, when you have that on the blood vessel wall now, and then you remove it, it's like pulling that bug out of the spider web. You're going to take elements of the integrity of the wall of the blood vessel with you, and you're going to cause, at best, an inflamed wall of your blood vessel, which will lead to brain inflammation or swelling, which is the lesser form of evil that can come from this. And at the worst, you can cause a really weak blood vessel, or you could even imagine taking that beta amyloid plaque out may rip the entire blood vessel wall with it. Similar to if you glued something onto a wall, and then when you take it off, you take the paint with it.
Yeah, it's just like ripping off a scab.
Exactly. When you do this, at its worst, you create an opening between the blood vessel and the stuff that is outside of the blood vessel. That is where you get these risks and these realities of microhemorrhages or bleeding in the brain. And if there's enough of those, and if they are large enough or significant enough, they're going to cause, at the worst, death, and at the best, accelerated functional decline.
And again, it's incumbent that we are actually doing the monitoring that was established in those studies. And that goes back to the idea about how do we take the intense amount of investigation and monitoring that's in a clinical trial and say that we're going to do that exact same level of rigor in clinical practice.
Yeah. And it'd be great if we had independent verification of this 12 or 13%, brain swelling number. We don't have that. Notably, there were 3 clinical trial deaths, all in the Leqembi or the lecanemab arm. And there's an open label extension study with a total of about 20 deaths. Again, we're talking about Alzheimer's, we're talking about older folks, but they don't have the comorbidities. They're not expected to die in the next, 12 to 18 months, the length of the study. What I didn't realize, and what we have seen happen so often in antidepressants, specifically SSRI clinical trials, and the risk of suicide, which is very real. And again, kind of like smoking and lung cancer, the industry tries to create a seed of doubt and then hold on to that doubt for dear life. But in open label extensions of antidepressant clinical trials, participants are able or allowed to go from getting the placebo, and in the extended phase, they can enter into the drug treatment arm. Because you assume that if they were depressed and they didn't get any sort of treatment, then they may still be depressed and opt into the other side of the trial. If in those trials, and we'll talk about this later more at length, but in those trials, if they then become suicidal, it's very easy for the company and the paper itself to keep that data in the placebo group, because they were originally in the placebo group, even though obviously they never became suicidal until they were given the experimental drug after the study was up. Same thing happened in the lecanemab clinical trials.
Wow.
And one of the 3 clinical trial deaths was, according to the caretaker for this, I think she was a Florida woman in her mid-60s. She was in the placebo arm. She got her first infusion of lecanemab and didn't quite feel right. And then she got her second infusion and had a rapid decline, was found to have extensive brain bleeds, confusion, word finding difficulty, and eventually started having intractable seizures and brain death eventually.
Which is horrible.
Yep. And her family opted to withdraw treatment. But this open label extensions, they allow for further disintegration of the data because they allow for the patient to opt in for the drug treatment. And then if I don't have access to the original data, and the news articles, the investigative reports on this, they still don't know confirmatorily whether or not that patient was in the placebo group or in the drug treatment group, because that information is not available to us.
Just to be clear to any listeners or viewers, is this idea about transitioning to an open label extension is not unique to this drug. That is a common thing that's done for many, many, many clinical trials.
It'd be nice to have access to that data. You know, not all of these deaths are necessarily related to the treatment because you are dealing with a little bit older population, but it's just telling that there's a lot more deaths in the Leqembi group than the placebo group. As Gami pointed out to me when I asked him about ketamine, you know, he said, I'm not going to say that ketamine causes people to kill themselves, but when you've got, you know, a very small amount of numbers, when you're talking about something like suicide, and in the extension of the study, you've got 5 deaths in the ketamine group, it certainly doesn't make you feel super confident that ketamine doesn't maybe have a long-term pro-suicide effect, or less confidence in the assertion that ketamine is anti-suicidal. Not to mention this drug, again, is also like aducanumab. It's very expensive. It's very time intensive. I think the average MRIs per year is 5 of them. That's got to be close to $15,000. You've got to get a genetic workup. There's a lot of people who don't qualify for it. You know, there's some fucking back alley bullshit that goes with these drugs in the FDA approval process. The FDA, or I don't know if it was the FDA or the company, they touted this drug as a foundational advance. And they paired that with this letter to the FDA in their petition for approval. It was signed by 230 providers and researchers. Wow, that's a lot of, you know, scientists that presented to the FDA in the January 2023 original petition. Turns out the majority of those signers were either recent consultants or grant recipients of Atai or Biogen. Huh.
Yes.
Funny. So, you know, it points again to, if you see all the smoke and you keep seeing smoke,
there's a fire.
You got to assume there's a fire, right?
Yeah.
You can't see it, but the confidence is totally destroyed in the institutions and in the regulatory processes. It also speaks to a direct problem with this direct-to-consumer advertising. I mean, do you want any more proof or additional credence that the U.S. mass media on both sides are just promulgating pharmaceutical interests? Are they doing their job as actual defenders of truth, defenders of the American public, or are they just promulgating these interests? The like key piece here is the way that these things are presented, and this idea of relative risk versus absolute risk. Have you ever heard on those commercials the absolute risk?
No, of course not.
Or the absolute effect?
And that goes back to, again, because what we look at with this is the emotional impact. And going back to the direct consumer ads, one of the ones I show in my lecture is, I forget if it was donepezil or memantine, I think it was donepezil, but one of the ads was very clear. It said, give her the will to fight. And the individual with the dementia was staring right at the image. And it was, the assumption is, if you're not giving this medication, you're not giving your family member a chance to fight. And that is a manipulative way of looking at
manipulative.
it. But and that's the idea, is that I want to do something. And that's, and I don't want to say we're preying on it, but if you don't do this, you're not doing enough. Even if it doesn't work, give them a chance. But at what cost? And again, not just dollars, but some of these adverse effects and quality of life. And what are the alternatives there?
Yeah. And the money that it costs too. You're going to pay thousands and tens of thousands of dollars for a drug that's going to lead you to die earlier.
One of the headlines initially was, aducanumab will bankrupt Medicaid.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And if you're indiscriminately using it, you know, Not that I want to put value on human life, but that if you're spending the money on this, you're not doing other things, whether it's behavioral approaches or therapy or memory groups or all the other things we can do to improve quality of life.
It really kind of denigrates my belief in our media institutions. The other huge factor here is we're not just talking about efficacy and absolute risk reduction or the absolute change in the effectiveness. The number needed to harm,
There we go. There we go.
there's a number needed to treat and a number needed to harm. The number needed to treat is how many do I have to give this drug to get a benefit in one person. The number needed to harm is how many people do I have to give this to see a harm in one person. Number needed to harm should be in the double digits.
Yep.
For any drug that you're trying to use or trying to get, marketed and available and approved. The number needed to harm of lecanemab is 3.
That's where we have to compare the apples to apples. Part of it is what is the outcome we want versus the outcome what we don't want. And if you can critically say that gives you a risk versus benefit.
Beyond that, there are treatments that are available that have better data than aducanumab, than lecanemab, than donanemab, donepezil, or Aricept. They have a 1-year study that shows a relative risk reduction of 38%. And it has a known and a studied safety profile. Yeah. It is extremely safe drug to use. You've got lithium, which I'm a huge proponent on. There are meta-analyses of the lithium dementia studies, including some clinical trials, that show a relative risk reduction of 60 to 65%. You also have the data that bipolar patients who typically get dementia almost a decade earlier than the general population because they smoke more and they've got higher obesity rates, they've got higher diabetes, they've got all of these other risk factors for dementia and inflammation. The ones on lithium develop dementia at the same rate as the general population.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier, it is possible that lithium, again, they're still learning about it, but that by regulating phosphorylation, lithium can maybe even have an effect on some of these amyloid or tau. I know they're looking into what that actually does, but like you said, we have some treatments we can use that are dirt cheap, do some really good stuff.
And do a great job of preventing this from progressing so that we're not trying to scramble to fix a process that has hundreds, if not thousands of different factors over a lifetime contributing to the development of this. And we have this hubris to think that we're just going to be able to give a drug that's going to reverse it in a few months or a couple of years. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, you've got Michael Niels, the German MD, PhD, who has put out the unified theory of Alzheimer's disease that points out, aside from the way that we're living modernly, that Alzheimer's was a rare condition back in the day. And part of that's probably due to us not living as long, but even the people who would live that long did not develop Alzheimer's at the rates that we're developing it today. But what people don't realize, what patients with Alzheimer's don't realize, they're being promised something that could take the rest of their life away. And a lot of that life could be, very, very There's so many patients with Alzheimer's who, out of a 30-point cognitive test, they get a 25 or a 24 out of 30. All the points they miss are the 5 points that are, hey, remember these 5 words, and I'm going to ask you about them in 5 minutes. And they can't remember that. But they can still go to Pilates. They can still play with their grandkids. They can still volunteer or even work in certain capacities.
You're assuming we've even diagnosed the Alzheimer's correctly.
Exactly. Right. There's a lot of assumptions that go into this. We didn't talk about donanemab, but I just assume it's the next in the long line of iterations. I saw something that said that it was maybe even had less effectiveness or something like that.
That's good.
Right. You want to try to give like a little bit of a summary of our discussion here tonight?
Yeah, I think one mainstay is, again, the idea that as we look at conditions, we need to be as objective as we can. Some conditions that have a lot of, whether it's negative press, a lot of emotion with it, we still need to ascribe to a rigorous scientific model of how we evaluate these drugs. We've got to be consistent in that model of how we determine what is, an appropriate clinical trial, and did they follow that trial? And if there's a deviation, we still need to have the time to go back and do that study again rigorously. So the case of 301, a repeat of it. We need to acknowledge, this is a good, microcosm of the issues with scientific design is, and then, risk and benefit, and looking at the number needed to harm versus the number needed to treat, and determining, is the drug more likely to harm or to help? And we need to be able to do that as objectively as we can. And some of that objectivity, again, is being willing to acknowledge that it's going to take time. And even though we really want this drug to work, if it is not going to be beneficial, or if there are some serious side effects, we need to acknowledge that. But we also need to make sure that the scientific community is objective. And again, we're not giving that one person so much power to where they can manipulate slides for 20 years and build up a theory that we then have to call into question, but also then in independence of looking it up, so that we're not entirely looking at people's livelihoods or 30,000 employees of a company who are all dependent on this drug getting approved, but we can make sure that there's an organization that can simply say, did the drug work or not? And it's not tied to stock prices, or it's not tied to people getting fired or not.
If I had 5 words to guide one directive, and if I could have this over anything else, give us the original data.
5 words. Yes, I counted. Yes,
on
that's 5 words.
Everything.
That's 7 words.
If every single study, everyone had access to the original set of data, then it would be a lot harder for companies to get away with manipulation, for the regulators to get away with not regulating, and for us to buy into the bullshit that is consistently spewed out to us, telling us what to believe about safety and efficacy of drugs that data just doesn't support.
Yeah, so you're going to give me your family's cookie recipe is what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So, moral of the story, put as many chocolate chip cookies in whatever cake or pie that you are baking and say that it's the best.
Right.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only. The information provided in this podcast and related materials are meant only to educate. This information is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice. While I am a medical doctor and many of my guests have extensive medical training and experience, nothing stated in this podcast nor materials related to this podcast, including recommended websites, texts, graphics, images, or any other materials, should be treated as a substitute for professional, medical, or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All listeners should consult with a medical professional, licensed mental health provider, or other healthcare provider if seeking medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
thanks again for watching and or listening. If you're passionate about the subjects that I discuss on the channel, do me a favor and like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make your voice heard, that these are problems that must be addressed in our society. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I want to hear them. Feel free to reach out on social media or email us at renegadepsych@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be a guest of the show, or you have a connection to somebody that you think would be a good guest, let us know. Thanks again for listening.